By the media, Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning. Welcome to the Point on GB News with me, Bev Turner, and Andrew Pearce.
Boris Johnson, there he was yesterday. He was in fighting form in Parliament yesterday. What did you make of his performance before those MPs about Partygate? Do you believe him? Do you care?
Yeah, does it matter? Rishi Sunak has seen off a backbench revolt by Tory hardliners opposed to his Brexit deal with Northern Ireland. We were talking about this yesterday, of course. 22 Conservative rebels, including Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, voted against the Stormont break regulations. We'll explain what that means.
And it's 3 years to the day since Boris locked us down. Where were you when that happened? Was it, for you, a JFK moment? Where were you?
And also, the US Federal Reserve. We speculated yesterday whether they would raise interest rates. They did, by 1/4 point, increasing the likelihood that the Bank of England will do the same today. The move comes amid a shock rise in inflation to 10.4%. We will bring you the official decision in the UK here as it happens.
Let us know your thoughts on all our talking points, so you know what to do. Email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk. We'll get stuck into all the top stories. But first, the news with Rhiannon Jones.
Good morning, it's 9:32. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Bank of England's widely expected to raise the interest base rate for the 11th time in a row later. Economists are predicting a hike from 4 to 4.25 percentage points. The bank faces a balancing act between reining in inflation and ensuring financial stability. It comes after a surprise rise in inflation to 10.4% last month, and the decision by the US Federal Reserve to raise its key rate overnight. Sir Keir Starmer is promising to crack down on serious violent crime in England and Wales if Labour win the next general election. It's after the Conservatives accused them of being soft on crime. In a speech later, Sir Keir will pledge to halve levels of violence against women and girls within a decade. He'll also announce his party's plan to raise confidence in the police following the damning report into the Met. And Rishi Sunak paid more than £1 million in tax over the last 3 years. The Prime Minister's published his long-awaited personal tax documents, showing he paid £432,000 in tax in the last financial year. It follows the commitment he first made during his Tory leadership campaign last summer, when asked if he could understand what it's like for people struggling to heat their homes. Mr. Sunak said he's on the people's side.
Ultimately, what people are interested in is what I'm going to do for them. And, you talk about the cost of living. Of course, that's the number one priority that I'm grappling with. That's why last year we took a decision to tax the windfall profits of energy companies. We're taxing them at 75%, and we're using that money to help pay people's energy bills. So over the course of this winter and beyond, we're going to be paying about £1,500 of most people's energy bills. That's the type of support we're providing to help people, and that should give people a sense that I am on their side. I'm doing everything I can to help them.
TV online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn, this is GB News. Now it's back to Bev and Andrew.
Very good morning. Welcome to The Point on GB News with me, Bev Turner, and Andrew Pearce. Now, of course, were you watching it yesterday? Did you watch the whole 3 hours?
No.
Well, Boris Johnson clashed with MPs. He got this grilling, didn't he? He had to face over allegations that he lied to Parliament.
The questioning came. Harriet Harman, of course, the Labour MP, chaired the proceedings. And on the same time, the MPs voted on Rishi Sunak's Windsor Framework, the Brexit deal. It went through with a massive majority, despite 3 former Tory leaders voting against.
So to discuss all of this, we're joined by Lord Edward Lister, the former Downing Street Chief of Staff between 2019 and 2021. Good morning, Lord Lister. Broadly, brushstrokes, what did you take from Boris Johnson's grilling yesterday? Did you manage to endure the whole 3 hours?
No, I didn't watch it all, I'm afraid. I had other things to do as well. But I watched, I think, quite a lot of it. And I was mightily impressed by his performance. I thought he came out fighting. I thought he gave a good explanation of what took place. And I thought, I know that was, you could argue, a fairly biased group of people, but I think there must have been enough doubt created by the evidence he put forward and what he said. And I think he was very, very clear. He did not deliberately mislead Parliament.
And his take was, you seem to be suggesting, the committee, that the fact he took advice from his officials, why wouldn't he take his advice? He says his officials said, again and again, they weren't breaking the rules.
That's right. He kept on making that point. Then they started having a go into why didn't you take legal advice and all the rest of it. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, how far do you go on these things? I thought he gave a very credible, reasonable explanation about what took place in Downing Street at a particularly difficult time. And I think it is worth just remembering it was a hard time. It was difficult. There were a limited number of people in their offices. And Downing Street, there were, 150 people in that building? It's a very small building. It's quite cramped at the best of times. And it's an old building. So, social distancing is never going to be easy in a place like that.
Shouldn't the point be, though, Lord Lister, I can call you Eddie, we've known each other for so long, Eddie, shouldn't the point be that Boris, an intelligent man, should have known that actually a leaving do for Lee Kane, where he made a speech, lots of booze there, wasn't appropriate?
Yes, and I think that he said 2 things on this. Firstly, that he didn't really appreciate that point at the time, and he should have done later, and he acknowledged that and apologised for that. But he also made the point about morale and keeping morale up at a difficult time when people were at work. Look, yes, it was a mistake. He shouldn't have done it, and he said so, and he apologised.
Let me tell you what it was like for me. It was a bit like a medieval battle and the drummer boy is in the background keeping morale going. At some point, the drummer boy drops his drumstick and thus ensues an inquiry into why the drummer boy dropped his drumstick, as opposed to the damage and the collateral disaster which has sprung from lockdowns. I mean, the ludicrousness of, did you pass someone a pen? I felt like I was watching some sort of Jonathan Swift satire. It was like the stuff of Gulliver's Travels. It was Brobdingnagic. It was ridiculous. Do you think people really want us to be dwelling on whether he lied about breaking the rules, or whether we want a full inquiry into what the logic was behind them in the first place?
Look, I think everybody acknowledges a difficult time. And yes, some things happened that shouldn't have happened, and he's apologised for that. But it's an old building. Just in the office I was in, for example, and I had a desk opposite Dominic Cummings. So we were together. And between us was a Perspex screen. I'm sure many of your viewers sit in offices where you've got two desks facing each other, and we have a Perspex screen between us. There's another couple of desks a bit further along with a Perspex screen between us. We were doing our best to have social distancing as much as you can. I mean, if I turn round, it's his door behind me. So, you know, we're all very close together. So you do your best. Yes, there shouldn't have been those drinks parties, but did people have a drink at their desk? Probably yes. I mean, you know, things happen. You're there for months and months. And it's worth remembering people in Downing Street weren't off. They weren't working from home. They were all working in the office very hard, coming in very early in the morning, because the drumbeat of that building, it's the same today as it was then, and as it has been for years. It's a starting time of around 8 o'clock because the drumbeat of the day demands that, and you rarely leave before 8 o'clock in the evening. That is the working day. And anybody who's worked there will tell you that's what it's like, day in, day out.
I get that, and I know that building well, not as well as you, because you work there. But people say, yeah, but doctors and nurses were under huge pressure. They weren't having drinks after work. They weren't having a booze fridge in the study.
I am not defending that. And to be fair, he apologised for that. And I think that's... What else do you do? I think you do something. Well, should he have apologised a bit earlier, and that was a criticism they made? Possibly, yes. Possibly there was a bit of a timing issue there, but that's all.
The thing is, for me as well, he was still sort of lying as of yesterday in terms of the science. So when he was saying, this ludicrous notion of whether you passed a pen to someone or did you hand a drink to someone, and Boris is saying we were washing our hands, they knew really quickly in May 2020 that SARS-CoV-2 wasn't passed on fomites, on hand contact, and yet. Why wasn't he able to say that yesterday?
I picked that one up as well. I don't know why he didn't say that.
Because we know what he thinks people want to hear.
We all knew that. Yeah. And that was, I mean,
but this is the legacy. For me, it's the legacy of Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair. We often say that on this show. This is politics by worrying about what other people are going to think. Where are your principles? Where are your values? Where do you stand up for yourself and you say, you may think this is wrong, but I'm going to tell you the truth? Where's that gone?
Yes, and I take that point completely. And can I just take it a bit further, if I may?
Please do.
This was a difficult time. When COVID first started and the lockdowns commenced, there was conflicting advice coming in as to the cause of COVID, the effects of COVID, how COVID was being transmitted. At one point, it was if you passed a pen to somebody who could be passing COVID, then it was established it wasn't. It was an evolving situation. Now, we've got vaccines in this country. We got them before anybody else. Things like that, things like the rules that were done, were all being arranged, sorted out in his cabinet room. There were people meeting there almost continuously to work through all of these different things. Yes, you know, we kept social distancing. Yes, nobody sat next to somebody else. Yes, you were always a couple of, seats apart. Yes, all the doors were open. You can't open the windows in that place. That doesn't work that way. But you can open the doors, and they were open into the garden. Yes, people even had meetings in the garden. Seriously, meetings in the cold, because that was the right thing to do. So I think it is just ridiculous to keep on saying people were not observing the social distancing. They were, to the best of their ability.
This committee could finish his career if they recommend a suspension of 10 days or more. That's a by-election. No more Boris Johnson. How would you react to that?
I think that would be appalling. I really do think that would be appalling. I can understand why they have to wrap his knuckles. I get that. I get that completely. But I think there's a world of difference between, something minor and something very serious. I do not think this is so serious that you should destroy somebody's career.
And he has already resigned as Prime Minister.
That's pretty extreme by anybody's standards. And that's the kind of thing you do for something terrible. This isn't. This is pretty minor in the overall scheme of things.
Yeah. Which I bring back to my medieval battle analogy. That's like sacking the drummer for dropping the drumstick rather than the mess which is created around the outside.
Before we let Lord Lister go, I'm just going to ask you one last question. Boris joined the rebellion against the Windsor Framework.
Yes.
Only 22 MPs. 3 it was a mistake strategically, wasn't it, by Boris? It's not a great Brexit deal, but it's better than we got.
I think it was, because I mean, look, it's not a great deal, but it's a better deal than we had before. And don't forget, when you're dealing with Northern Ireland, you've got sort of civil war at one extreme or a trade war with Europe at the other. And wherever you strike it in between, you're in a pretty good territory. This was pretty good territory, and I think this would... he should have
You were
accepted.
by his side when he got his own Brexit deal, if you recall. Do you think he'd have accepted the Windsor Framework deal when he was Prime Minister?
I think he would have done. But look, Europe is all about missed opportunities, by Europe, by the way, because if they had agreed this, and this, by the way, is something that was being asked for a long time ago, we wouldn't have got into where we are today.
All right, that's Lord Lister. He was Boris Johnson's Chief of Staff. I have this view if you'd stayed Boris Johnson's Chief of Staff, he'd still be Prime Minister. But that's a conversation for another time. Lord Lister, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Now, if you were watching us yesterday, you would have seen us discussing whether the Federal Bank in America was going to raise interest rates, and if so, what would that mean for us? Well, Liam Halligan is here to tell us what happened. What happened in America? What's it going to mean for us, Liam?
Well, the US Federal Reserve, the most important central bank in the world, did raise interest rates to roughly 5%. They have a band, unlike us. So they raised interest rates, even though their inflation is only 6%. Our inflation, of course, is 10.4%. It went up unexpectedly earlier this week, that February number. So the Bank of England really is on the horns of a dilemma here, because on the one hand, inflation's going up, so you'd expect them to increase interest rates to bear down on that inflation. On the other hand, there are lots of market jitters. People are worried about banks falling over.
Yeah.
So you'd want to keep interest rates where they are, so you don't roil financial markets even more. So, I mean, I'm never going to be asked to be on the Monetary Policy Committee. That ship has sailed. A bit too independent-minded. Maybe I know a bit too much economics for that job.
It's supposed to be independent-minded, that committee. Isn't that the whole point of it?
Well, the Treasury appoints them all these days, so clearly
You're
not.
exactly what they need. You're exactly what they need.
They're going to put them up, aren't they?
I think they will put them up, but I would say to hard-pressed households who are worried about making their mortgage payments, I do think that this will be the last interest rate rise. So I think interest rates will peak at 4.25%. This will be the 11th interest rate rise in a row. They needn't have gone this high. They needn't have been raised this quickly. The reason they have gone so high and they have been raised so fast is because the Bank of England, for months and months and months, was asleep on the job and kept dismissing fears of inflation raised by renegades like me as nonsense, and they said inflation would be transitory, and it hasn't been transitory.
Yeah, the Governor of the Bank of England, remind me his name, Andrew...
Bailey.
Useless.
Well...
You agree?
The guy's got a degree in history rather than...
Yeah, it's bizarrely.
Economics. Look, he's there. He is the Governor of the Bank of England. I do think he's got some good advisors around him.
Right.
And I'm not saying central banking is easy.
Yeah.
It isn't easy. What I am saying, though, is that the Bank of England and pretty much our entire policy-making establishment wasn't alive enough to the possibility of inflation down the track. And by the way, even before the war in Ukraine, inflation was at a 30-year high. So let's not blame it all on those geopolitical issues.
Let's ask you about the Prime Minister putting out his tax returns yesterday. That was clever. Big day, good day to bury bad news. He's published his tax returns. He earned quite a lot of money, didn't he?
He didn't actually publish his tax returns. He published a kind of 3-page summary of his previous 3 tax returns compiled by his accountant. Over the last 5 years in the UK, we don't know about his US tax return, of course, because he's not publishing that. In the UK, he made about £5 million. In the last year, he made £1.9 million. You know, he's a successful guy. I don't think British people mind if you're successful as long as you're honest.
Yeah.
A lot of people think, well, if my kid was smart and made that kind of money, I'd be pleased.
Because his money's in a blind trust, so we don't know where he earns the money
for him or her. I think what is difficult is that, you know, for the vast majority of people, it isn't that he earned 1.9 million quid, it's that he earned less than 200,000 of that from his day job, being the Prime Minister and an MP. So the vast majority of his income was, as we say in the trade, unearned. That doesn't mean he didn't do anything to earn it, but it's from dividends and investments and so on. So he will have a problem with many people, because these are sums of money people just can't get their heads around. They seem grotesque, even if, of course, it's completely legal what he's done. And it seems to be maybe a little bit of bad luck on his part. It seems weird talking about bad luck when he's earning so much money, that he is Prime Minister at a time when there's a cost of living crisis, so his personal wealth comes to the fore, and it will make some people think, when they look at him, can you ever really understand how me and my family live?
And things like, I think we do need transparency, actually, on where Prime Ministers make their money, because there were question marks over whether he had shares in Moderna, or whether one of the companies that he invested in was one of the funders of Moderna. We need to know that kind of stuff, because did that influence decisions? Third year of lockdowns today, obviously anniversary. In your opinion, Liam, how badly did that affect our economy?
Well, I'm proud that of my work, not just here on GB News, but on the Telegraph's Planet Normal podcast, which I co-present with Alison Pearson. We've got an interview today, part one of our two-part lockdown special with Anders Tegnell, who masterminded the lockdown policy, or the lack of lockdown policy in Sweden. I think lockdown was probably the worst policy error in post-war British history. I think it did enormous economic, psychological and medical damage to people. We've got 150,000 kids who haven't gone back to school. We've got massive mental health crises. We've got massive NHS waiting lists. I think when you look at the excess deaths table, Britain has done OK, but Sweden, who had voluntary lockdown, of course, did far, far better. They never closed schools, which I think was vital. And I think the public inquiry into lockdown has been far too long getting going. There's no deadline for when it finishes.
80 million
in contrast, Sweden, France, Italy, they've all finished their public inquiries. We desperately need the establishment not to kick this into the long grass. We need to be asking tough questions about why we made the decisions that we made. Yeah. And I must say, I don't think the public inquiry will be the same now that the Telegraph and Isabel Oakeshott have released all those WhatsApp messages. I think it will be much less of a whitewash than it otherwise would have been.
Don't forget, the Bloody Sunday inquiry took 40 years.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we've got a long way to go.
Absolutely. Right, thank you, Liam. As we were just saying, it was on this day in 2020 that the first lockdown was announced.
Boris Johnson did it with the intention of keeping us safe, saying the critical thing is what we must do is stop the disease spreading between households.
Lockdowns were tough for many people. What impact has it had psychologically? We're talking now to psychologist Emma Kenny. Emma, very difficult, I guess, to sum up 3 years of psychological stress for so many people and relationship damage. Can I take you back to that day, this day 3 years ago? What was your first reaction when you heard Boris Johnson say you must stay at home?
Well, I suppose it was disbelief and a bit of astonishment, because it was something entirely new and no one had ever told me that I wasn't allowed to do certain things in the way that I was used to being able to do. So I guess for the first week, I just got my head down and got on with it. I didn't really feel it was necessary. But then by week 3, I started to speak out about the fact that, firstly, you don't lock up abusers with their children. Secondly, you certainly don't affect poverty even further than we know it was going to be affected by the ordinary economy. And most importantly, in a democratic society where we have a level of autonomy over our choices, no one really had a right to do that. And with education in particular being affected as well, I think I was very blindsided at the end, because what I felt was automatically anybody who dared to say that psychological well-being, children's needs, safeguarding is important, was immediately vilified and called a murderer. So I think I went through that initial 3 weeks in disbelief, shock, and also a kind of positivity that it'll all be over pretty immediately. And then, of course, it didn't, and it wasn't, and it's been catastrophic.
after that, I think it was about the second lockdown, because of course the first lockdown, we can argue whether that was necessary or not. At the time, perhaps with the information, one might argue it was necessary. Boris Johnson said in that speech, didn't he, we got 3 weeks. Obviously, the repeated lockdowns and changing the goalposts and changing those deadlines, we know from the WhatsApp messages that was not scientifically based whatsoever. But I remember saying on social media, Emma, that I feel like I'm in an abusive relationship with the government because they were using those sorts of coercion techniques, and I got roundly vilified for that. But just talk a little bit about how the parallels existed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was certainly an immediate division in our society. And I think that one of the most powerful things that the government did was they used fear, and fear is very, very effective. It's what they use in cults. I mean, they make you do lots of different rituals that are completely unnecessary to convince you that there's a reason behind the actual changes to your behaviour and that it's going to protect you. And then you see in society that what happens is that with social media, and there's been a huge connection between big government, big tech, you were put in a place where the world around you decided that it was acceptable to be really abusive, really hostile, and to actually ignore the main emphasis of the messages that you and I, for example, were trying to get across, which is no one wants anybody to die. But actually what we're thinking about is the long-term impact, particularly on children. I remember a speech of mine being read out at government, and there was a line in it saying that safeguarding has been abandoned, and the aim of safeguarding is to protect the most vulnerable from abuse, harm and neglect. And actually what we were doing was instilling abuse, harm and neglect on the most vulnerable populations. So still to this day, I'm absolutely stunned that we went into the initial lockdown, because that was never the plan initially when you were dealing with a pandemic. Secondly, it didn't make any sense. We all know it didn't make any sense. But most importantly, there was a war on the freedom of thought. And even now, even today, that war on the freedom of thought is something that's really impacted on children and young people, because the messages are you're not allowed to think as an individual. You think as a host, you think as a horde, but you do not think as an individual, because if you do, you'll be critically analysed, you'll be vilified, and at times you'll actually be isolated and abandoned by the very society that's meant to welcome you. So I think it's not just the obvious psychological damage. I work in this area. I know exactly what the psychological damage is, and the whitewash of studies coming out right now denying that harm that everybody in this field knows has occurred. I know that there is a concerted effort to make it seem that there wasn't an impact on suicidality, self-harm and all the other areas. So this is a long-term impact of truth essentially being negated, and again, false science being initiated to carry a narrative that's done incredible damage. And what you said before, Bev, is exactly what should be noted. What happened to truth? What happened to admitting defeat? What happened to saying we've got to learn the lessons and the realities, we made horrible mistakes and these young people are going to pay for it very much generationally? At that point, you can start saying, at least we can leverage the harm and start moving forward. And it's just not happening.
Emma, if Boris was here, the Prime Minister, he would say he did it reluctantly because he felt he had no choice. He was trying to protect the country. He was trying to protect the country's health. No Prime Minister wants to close down an economy. No Prime Minister, in my view, should have closed down schools. That's another matter. But that's what he would argue. Isn't that a legitimate argument to make?
No. As a leader, it's your job to lead. We know full well that he didn't want to go into lockdown. We know full well that he was railroaded into lockdown. I'm sure there's been a lot of profiteering through that. In fact, the irony is that throughout all of this, what we've learnt is the government want you to be in a state of crisis. Big business wants you to be in a state where you feel that you need their services even when you don't, because crisis, fear, terror, they're the things that keep you constrained and make you act in ways according to their wishes. It's very profitable to be in panic. So at the end of the day, I would say he should have stuck to his morals, stuck to his beliefs, which was we shouldn't have gone into it. And it's a poor leader who isn't willing to make that decision at a cost potentially personally to themselves, but at a cost because they believe in it.
OK, thank you, Emma. Emma Kenny there, talking very passionate. There's a lot of people, you know...
But, of course, there was a political consensus. The Lib Dems, the SNP...
It was a consensus.
The Labour Party. The Labour Party wanted us to be locked down for even longer.
And the whole of the media jumped on board. Not here. You're with GB News. First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning and welcome to The Point on GB News with me, Andrew Pearce, and Bev Turner.
So this morning, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, of course, that the accusations he misled Parliament are complete nonsense. Did you watch much of that yesterday? 3 hours of it. Did you believe him? Does it even matter?
I'm not sure it does anymore. Rishi Sunak, you saw of a backbench revolt by Tory hardliners. Those backbench rebels included Boris Johnson. So, is Brexit now finally done?
And, of course, it is 3 years to the day since Boris Johnson announced that we were going into a national lockdown to apparently keep us safe from the coronavirus. Let me know your thoughts as we reflect on 3 years of change.
And it's pretty bad news on interest rates, I'm afraid. The US Federal Reserve raised interest rates yesterday by 0.25%. The Bank of England's meeting today. They're going to announce very soon whether they're putting up rates too. We'll let you know as soon as it happens.
GBviews at gbnews.uk is the email. As always, we've got some fantastic guests as well waiting in the wings. But first of all, here is your news with Rhiannon Jones.
Bev, thank you. Good morning. It's 2 minutes past 10. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Bank of England's widely expected to raise the interest base rate for the 11th time in a row later. Economists are predicting a hike from 4 to 4.25 percentage points. The bank faces a balancing act between reining in inflation and ensuring financial stability. It comes after a surprise rise in inflation to 10.4% last month and the decision by the US Federal Reserve to raise its key rate overnight. AJ Bell's head of financial analysis, Danny Hewson, says another rise will put yet more pressure on people already struggling with the cost of living crisis.
The Bank of England has to demonstrate that it is really serious about bringing prices down, because for ordinary people, those high prices are just eye-watering at the moment. They're causing a huge amount of harm. When you go shopping, you're having to pay a little bit more every time, and a lot of budgets just can't stretch any further.
And we'll have full coverage of the Bank of England's decision here on GB News from midday. Sir Keir Starmer is promising to crack down on serious violent crime in England and Wales if Labour win the next general election. It's after the Conservatives accused them of being soft on crime. In a speech later, Sir Keir will pledge to halve levels of violence against women and girls within a decade. He'll also announce his party's plans to raise confidence in the police following the damning report into the Met. Shadow Justice Secretary Ellie Reeves told GB News about Labour's plans to tackle crime.
Minimum sentences for rapists, introducing a minimum sentence of 7 years, setting up specialist rape courts so that we can fast track these cases through the system. At the moment, victims are waiting 3 years for their cases to get to court, which means that criminals aren't behind bars. We would also put domestic abuse call handlers in police control rooms and make sure that there are specialist rape and serious sexual violence units within every police force.
The UK and Welsh governments have announced 2 free ports will be created in Wales for the first time in a bid to boost the country's economy. The Celtic and Anglesey free ports in North Wales are expected to attract almost £5 billion in investment. It's also hoped they'll generate up to 20,000 jobs by the end of the decade. Rishi Sunak has paid more than £1 million in tax over the last 3 years. The Prime Minister's published his long-awaited personal tax documents. They revealed he paid £432,000 in tax in the last financial year. It follows the commitment he first made during his Tory leadership campaign last summer. When asked if he could understand what it's like for people struggling to heat their homes, Mr Sunak said he's on the people's side.
Ultimately, what people are interested in is what I'm going to do for them. And, you talk about the cost of living. Of course, that's the number one priority that I'm grappling with. That's why last year we took a decision to tax the windfall profits of energy companies. We're taxing them at 75%, and we're using that money to help pay people's energy bills. So over the course of this winter and beyond, we're going to be paying about £1,500 of most people's energy bills. That's the type of support we're providing to help people, and that should give people a sense that I am on their side. I'm doing everything I can to help them.
A man has been charged with 2 counts of attempted murder after 2 elderly men were set alight outside mosques in Birmingham and London. Mohammed Abker from Edgbaston in Birmingham will appear at Coventry Magistrates Court later this morning. The 28-year-old's alleged to have sprayed the 2 victims before setting them alight in separate incidents. 70-year-old Mohammed Reyes remains in hospital with severe burns to his face, hands and chest following Monday's attack in Birmingham. The Prince of Wales will speak with Ukrainian refugees and pay tribute to the inspiring humanity of Polish people on the 2nd day of his surprise visit to Poland. In the last few minutes, the Prince laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Warsaw. He says the trip will allow him to thank troops and underline his support for the Polish people. Nicola Sturgeon will face her final First Minister's questions later after more than 8 years as head of the Scottish Government. It's after she announced last month she was stepping down from her role. She said she no longer has the stamina to carry on in the pressured and demanding role. The First Minister had said she'd remain in office until her successor is chosen. And Sir Jim Ratcliffe and Sheikh Jassim are both expected to submit second improved bids to buy Manchester United after the deadline was extended. A cut-off of 9 p.m. last night had initially been set for the Ineos owner and Qatari banker, the only bidders to have gone public. A first round of bidding took place last month, and it's understood there are as many as 8 other potential investors. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens now, though. It's back to Bev and Andrew.
Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. So yesterday, Boris Johnson clashed with MPs during a 3-hour grilling over allegations that he lied to Parliament.
The questioning came as Parliament voted on that Brexit deal, the so-called Windsor framework. Huge majority for Rishi Sunak. Tory revolt, including 3 former Tory leaders, including Boris Johnson.
So Kevin Schofield, political editor at HuffPost UK, joins us now. Good morning, Kevin.
Morning.
Good morning. Did Boris Johnson do the right thing, do you think, yesterday, backing the rebels on this, or not?
I think it showed that his influence amongst Conservative MPs is not what it once was. The rebellion at one point looked as though it would be bigger than it was. In the end, I think Downing Street will be pretty happy that they kept it to in the 20s. I mean, obviously, as you just said there were significant rebels, not just Boris Johnson, Ian Duncan-Smith, Liz Truss, big names in the Conservative Party. But I think it demonstrated that in many ways, Rishi Sunak has won. He's seen off his big rival, Boris Johnson, and I think it's going to be quite difficult from here on in for Boris Johnson to mount a fight back.
What about yesterday, the Privileges Committee, Kevin? Harriet Harman opened her remarks by, she chaired the proceedings, of course. We've yet to reach our conclusion, she said. A lot of people watching would think, yes, you have, Harriet. You're going to find him guilty of misleading Parliament because you've already said that in tweets.
Well, and not just that, there was the interim report that came out a couple of weeks ago from the committee, which was pretty damning in itself. It's fair to say, I think, that the committee, which we should remember, most MPs on it are actually Conservatives, are sceptical that Boris Johnson did not mislead Parliament. They think that it should have been obvious to him that these gatherings that he attended in Downing Street during lockdown were breaking the rules. So I think it was incumbent on Boris Johnson yesterday to try and win them over. I think it's safe to say that he was pretty well briefed. He was unusually focused, at least initially, in his evidence-giving session. But I think on the whole, I don't think he's done enough to change their mind, certainly going by the tone of the questioning and indeed the tone of his answers. He lost his temper once or twice. I think he was pretty frustrated at the whole episode. So yeah, all eyes now on what the committee's conclusions are and whether or not they recommend that he be suspended for more than 10 days, which obviously would then result in a by-election.
But here's just so Bev, on it, Kevin, here's the point, isn't it? So the committee makes a recommendation. It's then up to the Commons. MPs will have a free vote. A lot of Tory MPs might think, to hell with that. I'm not voting to bring down a prime minister, because it would effectively bring Boris Johnson down. He'd be finished if there was a 10-day suspension. There'd be a by-election. He'd lose it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it'd be a huge moment if that was put to a Commons vote. Downing Street have already said that it would be a free vote. And then you're right, it'd be a massive challenge then on individual Conservative MPs, mindful obviously of the fact that on the doorsteps, if you speak to Conservative MPs, Boris Johnson, a lot of them tell me, is still very popular with their voters. So are they really going to go against their constituents and vote to kick him out of Parliament effectively? So that would be a remarkable Commons moment were it to come to that. I just suspect that the committee might decide to sanction him, but not go as far as to recommend the ultimate sanction so that he'll get like a slap in the wrists effectively. He will perhaps be suspended from Parliament, which would be remarkable for a former Prime Minister, but it may not be enough to trigger a by-election.
Kevin, there's There are parallels with what's going on in America at the moment with Trump. And the more that the left start to demonise Trump, the more his hardcore fan base gets behind him. And I think there are parallels with Boris Johnson here, because even though people like me quite liked seeing him squirm under the spotlight of his own ludicrous rules, I felt like he was to some extent hoisted by his own petard. If this is what does for him, even people like me will see the injustice in it. You know, if obfuscating around these silly little rules, which at the time, you know, were mainly theatre, and dancing around this ridiculous regime of theatrical measures to stop an airborne virus. If this is what does for him, you might even have people like me saying, no, hang on a minute, that's not why he should have lost his job.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps I spoke to one Labour MP last night who said actually he may well be strengthened by this, you know, that it might not look great to voters, the image of Boris Johnson being almost bear-baited by a lot of MPs in a committee room. I'm not entirely sure. I still think voters are annoyed at the fact that Boris Johnson stood up night after night on the television and told us all to stick to lockdown rules. But behind the scenes in Number 10, they clearly weren't doing that. I think that still annoys an awful lot of people. And that ultimately may well end up being how people remember him.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, very much. Thanks, Kevin.
Kevin Schofield from the HuffPost. Thanks for joining us, Kevin. Now,
do you know what I mean? I made a bit of a mess of that question.
No. I know what you mean. I think Kevin's right too. I think the committee will rebuke him. I think they'll recommend he's suspended for a couple of days, which will be humiliating for a former Prime Minister. But it's only when it gets to 10 days or beyond, then there can be a by-election, which he would lose.
Yeah, but you know what I mean? Like, those people who like Boris Johnson, they will remember that he got sacked for the wrong reasons, twice maybe, you might say. You know, but he lost his role in politics for the wrong reasons. And if he decides to come back in several years' time, then he will have a lot of people behind him, a bit like we were saying about Trump in America.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Prince William, Prince of Wales, of course, it still sounds odd calling him Prince of Wales, doesn't it? Prince William is in Poland. He's talking to British and Polish troops for their support in helping Ukraine defend its territory. Of course, this comes just days after the war criminal Vladimir Putin was doing his stuff in Ukraine.
So our royal reporter Cameron Walker is there in Warsaw. Lucky you, Cameron. Looks like a beautiful day there in Poland. How has William's visit gone down with the forces there?
Yes, Bev, it's pretty sunny and warm, actually, here in Warsaw, which is a bit of a contrast to the engagement Prince William has just done. It was quite a solemn engagement, laying a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier here in Warsaw. I suppose it's the equivalent monument of the cenotaph back in London. But it's an engagement which echoes one carried out by Prince William's grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, and Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, back in 1996 when they were here on a state visit in Poland. And Prince William, following the wreath-laying, actually signed a condolence book. It was written in Polish. He didn't write it. It was printed. But the Polish translation is to commemorate those who made the ultimate sacrifice, His Royal Highness Prince William. And troops and soldiering was very much a theme of yesterday's surprise engagements. Prince William was in southeastern Poland, very close to the border with Ukraine, thanking both British and Polish troops for working together to support the people of Ukraine in defending their land and their, and I quote, shared determination to defend our collective freedom. And the city close to where Prince William was yesterday is called Rzeszów, and that is seen by some as the gateway into Ukraine in terms of getting Western arms into Ukraine. And Prince William made a point of viewing some of those Western arms which will be used by Ukraine to defend their freedom and their land against the Russian invasion. But another big theme of Prince William's trip is very much the humanitarian side of things, highlighting the plight of Ukrainian refugees who have come here to Poland. At least 1.5 million have come, according to the United Nations Refugee Agency. Yesterday, he visited an accommodation centre which houses refugees who have recently come across to Poland fleeing that conflict. Just now, Prince William is on his way to meet the Polish president, where he is going to express his gratitude and support to the people of Poland for essentially sacrificing what they have in order to help out their closest neighbour of Ukraine. And later on today, Prince William is going to be visiting more Ukrainian refugees who have been here for over a year. But the timing is significant because it comes off the back of President Xi meeting the Russian president in Moscow. So perhaps British officials are hoping that Prince William's visit is going to strengthen relations between two NATO allies.
Thank you, Cameron. Enjoy Poland. Oh, sun's out here at least this morning. I quite fancy some fresh air today.
He's doing quite well, Prince William, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. He's all right. You know, I was going to say one foot in front of the other, like steady, but he was marching. So, but you know what I mean, literally and metaphorically. Roland says, I totally disagree with your guest describing Boris's partying and lies as pretty minor. My mother could not see her grandchildren before she died. Indeed, I was not able to visit her in hospital before she died. We could not have guests at her funeral, all because the rules were set. To break them for such trivial reasons and then lie about it as Prime Minister is totally unacceptable and very serious.
And Anne takes the opposite view. She says, thank goodness for Lord Lister. Lord Lister, of course, was Boris's Chief of Staff. He left just before the pandemic. Appearing on GB News this morning, the first time since Boris Johnson's trial, we've heard a true and honest report of proceedings.
And Nick has said, well said, Liam Halligan. Lockdown was a massive mistake. We just need the government to admit this. We're talking about this because, of course, today's 3 years since Boris Johnson put his fist on the table and said, you know, you must lock down. Do you remember where you were?
Yeah, I was. I knew it was coming. I knew the Prime Minister was going to speak, so I was glued to the TV. And I thought, blimey. And I thought, how long is this going to last? I talked to my partner about it. He said, do you think a few days or maybe a couple of weeks? I said, no, I think it's going to be months.
Did you?
I had a hunch. And I was right, unfortunately.
Is that because you understand politicians and you thought, we know for a fact that if you give a politician, a Prime Minister, this amount of power, they're not going to let it go easily?
Politicians, when they take power, never give it back. And they took more power than any time in peacetime. And I thought, if he's closing down the economy, schools, this is serious in his view. And this is not going to be for a few days, a few weeks. This is going to be for a very long time. OK. We've got a guest to talk about this. We're going to talk now to virologist Dr. Chris Smith and the independent statistician Jamie Jenkins join us on the show today. Good morning, gentlemen. Now then, Chris, you were one of these people, often for the last those 2 years of on and off lockdowns. Forgive me if you don't agree with me, but largely supporting the government's policies from a virologist point of view. Jamie Jenkins, on the other hand, was looking purely at the data and statistical analysis. So, Chris, when you look back now, do you think mistakes were made?
Just to correct the record, I wasn't supporting anybody. I was commenting and commentating on what was going on and trying to explain to people why the decisions, as far as the facts were known to us, were being made. When we first went into the pandemic, we didn't know what we were dealing with, and everybody in the world was very much in the dark. We'd never confronted this disease working in this way and spreading the way it was and infecting people and causing the impacts that it had before. And so whenever you confront something that's completely novel and you don't know what you're dealing with, the most important thing is to keep people safe while you learn. And you try to learn very, very quickly, which is what we tried to do. And during that process, inevitably, there will be some consequences. And one of those consequences might be taking steps to stop the spread of the infection. And once you know where you stand, then you make an informed choice. And that has happened in different countries at different rates at different times. But what everyone did to start with was to try, and it's the right thing to do, to try to stop the disease spreading while you learn. And so at the early days, when no one knew anything, the best thing to do was to be as decisive as possible and act as quickly as possible to try to stop the spread.
Did you not think, though, Chris, given that you were a virologist and knew what a pandemic preparedness plan was before this, that we threw that out of the window and quarantined the healthy? Did that not strike you as a little odd?
Well, in the first instance, we didn't know what we were going to be confronting and who the healthy were, or whether everyone was susceptible. The headlines that were coming from Lombardy in northern Italy, which really was the nucleus that spawned the international spread of the disease. We've got data showing that really that was the catalyst that then began to spread and disseminate the virus everywhere. It was affecting people who weren't just older people, although they were heavily represented in the numbers, but many younger people as well. And so very much being in the dark as we were, we didn't know what precisely the highest risk groups were at that time. And so therefore stopping the spread to the greatest extent possible with various measures is a sensible thing to do. The question is then what do you do next? Once you learn who the vulnerable people are, then do we open things up? Do we keep things closed? That was the question that I think when opinions began to diverge, and that began to happen later on in 2020.
Jamie Jenkins, 3 years on, where are you on this?
Yeah, so I think I support a bit of what Chris is saying there. Obviously, when we went into that first lockdown, there was a lot of groupthink going on across different countries. Obviously, one country was locking down, another country was going to lockdown. So, we know Sweden didn't. They were more for kind of a voluntary approach, but more countries were locking down, so they were kind of following each other. But I think, why did we lock down? Well, part of the reason we locked down was a lot of the modelling that was done at the start of the pandemic. So we saw, these big numbers of people who would be at risk and would die because of the pandemic. And one of the things you've got during the pandemic there is that when you get a model and they say, if you don't do something, this will happen. Well, if you do then go and do something, you can't mark how good was the modelling. So up until kind of December 21, we pretty much had the government making interventions. And it was that critical moment, I think, a bit later on in the pandemic, where I think some of the SAGE modelling was coming out saying we would have a certain number of deaths if Boris didn't bring any further measures in December 21. And that was the first time where you could actually mark the homework of the modelers, because Boris Johnson didn't do anything. And at that point in time, the actual deaths that they were predicting were 93% lower than what the model was suggesting as their central estimate. So the question there is then, you look back, in hindsight, obviously, was the modelling as bad earlier on in the pandemic, which led to some of these decisions?
Yeah. Chris, you must, as a virologist, have been interested, though, in the case of the Diamond Princess cruise ship. February 2020, quarantined off the coast of Hong Kong, Japan, wasn't it? 3,700 people on board. It was the perfect Petri dish analysis, and actually has been borne out 3 years later, have been an incredibly accurate indication of who was likely to catch it, who was likely to get ill, and who was likely to die. Why didn't you take those sorts of instances more seriously?
Well, again, you're confronting me as though I'm a politician making decisions. I'm a virologist who treats patients in hospital, and I'm occasionally asked for my opinion on these things. And I did give my opinion. What the Diamond Princess told us was that there are certain groups in society who do appear to be highly susceptible. If you look at the average age of a person who was on that cruise, they were older people. And when you put people into confined circumstances like a cruise vessel, where you can't do social distancing very easily, there's a lot of shared spaces, it's a big communal living environment, therefore it's ideal for certain diseases to spread. And we've known this for years. Things like norovirus, the winter vomiting bug, goes through cruise ships like wildfire if you allow it to. So in some respects, those outcomes were inevitable. What we didn't know was what the disease would do at a national level, because of course the population isn't just dominated by older people with pre-existing health conditions. It's a whole range from very young children through to much older people. And until you actually gather the data and learn and make informed decisions, you're really using one set of data to extrapolate to a different set of individuals. And you can make mistakes if you do that. So it's very important that you get the right sort of data to inform your decisions, but that does take time.
Talking about data, thank you, Chris. Jamie, one of the impacts of lockdowns has been our significant excess death statistics in this country. Just reflect on where we are with those now, because that, I think, is one of the things that has been largely neglected as a consequence of lockdowns.
Yeah, well, if you take an excess deaths from 2020 overall, then I suppose it was quite clear that we had their excess deaths during the first wave and the second wave of the pandemic. And you can't deny the fact that the COVID virus did have a big impact on a lot of lives being lost there. But as we've gone further on from the pandemic, because of some of the measures that were taken, we saw kind of the NHS pretty much closed down for a lot of things. Let's not forget, winter 2020 was really bad. They had to have a load more intensive care bed capacity to cope. But for a lot of the period when the capacity wasn't needed, I suppose, when the virus was at lower levels, there were still issues with the NHS and patients getting treatment. So we've seen these massive increases in the waiting lists. People trying to get GP appointments has been difficult. So over the last kind of 40 or so weeks, we have been seeing excess deaths, non-COVID excess deaths as well, linked in part to kind of issues that we have off the back of the NHS kind of closing down and these kind of waiting lists. And in the last 4 weeks, some reassuring stuff there in that they are starting to come back down to normal levels, but we are still seeing elevated deaths that you wouldn't expect if you look at just for population size in the ages up to the ages of kind of 44. So I think, we've got to reflect back, and it's not just the health thing that we're talking about here. Let's not forget, We've got the Bank of England going to increase interest rates again today and because of inflation. We had a huge printing of money during the pandemic as well. And that consequences of the lockdowns meaning demand went down with huge printing of money. We've got the economic stuff that we live in with many, many years ago. So I think there were many economic mistakes as well as potential health mistakes that were made over the last couple of years.
All right, we'll have to leave it there, gentlemen. That's Dr. Chris Smith and Jamie Jenkins. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, in a moment, we're going to hear about the impact the media had on lockdown and how we all behaved.
This is To The Point on GB News.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends were like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Well, the broadcaster, Tonya Buxton, you know well, joins us in the studio. Tonya.
Good morning. 3 years today since the first lockdown. How has your life changed?
It's changed dramatically, and I'm changed dramatically, and my family have changed dramatically because of what happened. I'm going to try very hard not to get emotional while we're talking about this, because this is a horrific time, and it's this 3-year anniversary. We do need to acknowledge what happened to us. So I lost my jobs. You know, I worked as a freelancer on Good Morning Britain and This Morning, and I've not been asked to do it again.
But tell us why, Tonya.
Because I was really very much an anti-lockdown,
right.
Very vocal on Twitter about anti-lockdowns and what I could see lockdowns were doing. And the reason for that is that I used to have a show on the Discovery Channel called My Greek Kitchen, and one of my fans from 15 years ago contacted me because her son committed suicide. And she just wanted to get onto those channels and express to other parents to be careful. If your son is, you know, in his room on his own, you know, keep an eye on your kids. And I just kind of got this blanket silence. And, you know, my manager said to me, you've got to stop, you know, you're not going to work again. She knew that. But then on top of that, just 2 months ago, my son's friend at rugby committed suicide. And the harms, my mother-in-law is dead because of lockdown. She didn't get her cancer diagnosis in time, so she's dead. So for me, lockdown has hurt my family draconianly, dramatically. And so when I have these people like Dr. Smith there, who's just kind of brushing over the things that he was condoning during that time, he was not taking any responsibility. He was a virologist who knew that this virus, we all knew it. I am no brain. I'm not very bright, actually, Andrew. I'm not. But I understood that this virus, and still to this day, its death rate is is older than you would die of all-cause mortality, 82. So I understood that. So locking down schools and shutting hospitals where people could get treatment, how could that make sense to anybody? And I was a primary school teacher in Tottenham for 8 years. And when the kids that I had, a lot of them suffered from horrific neglect. Not necessarily abuse, but neglect. And school,
very poor area.
Very poor. And school was their sanctuary. So I knew that there were so many children that would be suffering in tower blocks and tenements, not being able to get out or have any respite from that life that they have at home. I had a great lockdown. I have 4 kids. We were all cooking together. I have a garden. I had a great lockdown. Actually brought my family to get close together, if I think of it on that level. But I was walking around the house with insomnia, thinking, what's happening to the kids in Edmonton? What's going on? You know, what's happening there? And then when my mother-in-law got sick, and then realising that there was going to be so much collateral damage from this. And these journalists that were there and on Downing Street, not one of them asked this question. They all wanted to know, why aren't you looking down harder? Why aren't you looking down more? Why did journalists completely lose their minds?
Because there was a political consensus, that's what happened here. Every political party was supporting it. In fact, Labour was pushing for the lockdown to be even sooner.
Oh, gosh, well, forget Labour. I mean, maybe if they were in, Conservatives would have acted in a Conservative manner and did the right thing. But what is the definition of a journalist? What is that, to go with the political consensus? And since when has that been what a journalist is? I used to have such respect for journalists, especially those that were critical and analytical, digging stories, finding something new. I have no respect for them anymore. I put myself above them now because I question things that I wasn't qualified or educated to do. And yet I was looking through data, looking through studies. I was reading things like the Great Barrington Declaration. Those poor doctors and virologists that were standing up and saying, hang on a minute, is this right? Should we not do a cost analysis to see what this is going to mean? And they were vilified and brought down like I was. I was called a granny killer. My granny died. My granny is dead. Because of lockdown.
You reported that on social media,
Oh, my God, across the board, the hateful things I was caused, the awful things I was called. And my children got abused because of my stance as well. And yet, I don't feel vilified now. I just feel very sad.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you. Thanks so much. There's a lot of people out there will feel similar. Everyone was let down in various different ways, weren't they? Right, still to come. Sir Keir Starmer will promise to halve levels of violence against women and girls within 10 years of Labour taking office. That's all after your morning news.
10 years? Long time to wait, isn't it? For God's sake.
Good morning, it's 10:35. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The Bank of England's widely expected to raise the interest base rate for the 11th time in a row later. Economists are predicting a hike from 4 to 4.25 percentage points. The bank faces a balancing act between reining in inflation and ensuring financial stability. It comes after a surprise rise in inflation to 10.4% last month and the decision by the US Federal Reserve to raise its key rate overnight. Sir Keir Starmer's promising to crack down on serious violent crime in England and Wales if Labour win the next general election. It's after the Conservatives accused them of being soft on crime. Sir Keir will shortly pledge to halve levels of violence against women and girls within a decade. He'll also announce his party's plan to raise confidence in the police following the damning report into the Met. And Rishi Sunak paid more than £1 million in tax over the last 3 years. The Prime Minister has published his long-awaited personal tax documents showing he paid £432,000 in tax in the last financial year. When asked if he could understand what it's like for people struggling to heat their homes, Mr. Sunak said he's on the people's side.
ultimately what people are interested in is what I'm going to do for them. And, you know, you talk about the cost of living. Of course, that's the number one priority that I'm grappling with. That's why last year we took a decision to tax the windfall profits of energy companies. We're taxing them at 75%, and we're using that money to help pay people's energy bills. So over the course of this winter and beyond, we're going to be paying about £1,500 of most people's energy bills. That's the type of support we're providing to help people, and that should give people a sense that I am on their side. I'm doing everything I can to help them.
And in the last half hour, the Prince of Wales has laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Warsaw. On the second day of his surprise visit to Poland, Prince William will speak with Ukrainian refugees and pay tribute to the inspiring humanity of the Polish people. He says the trip will allow him to thank troops and underline his support for Poland. TV online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News.
It's 10:37. This is To The Point on GB News with Andrew Pearce and Bev Turner. Best part of the programme now. We've got the press panel here. The fabulous Carol Malone, my old mucker.
I'm too high here.
Always complaining about something. And Sam Smith, our very erudite. Sam Lister. Who's Sam Smith?
Sam Smith, that's the gender non-specific.
Sam Smith hasn't worked out whether he's a he or a she or an it or a they, has he, Sam Smith? Sam Lister.
Well, when we started the show with the Lord Lister and then we had Sam Lister, exactly. I did wonder if you were related,
no relation,
Sam,
no relation.
But no, not at all.
Let's go straight to Partygate. Come on, what did you think?
Do you know, I thought he did I'm going to go. I thought he did incredibly well. I was pretty impressed by it. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're a Boris lover or a hater, and that's really what this is all about.
We're going to have to stop you, Carol, because Keir Starmer, hold your excitement, is about to speak.
Oh, is it? Oh, God,
let's... He's Stoke-on-Trent. He's talking about violence against women. He's going to pledge to sort it out in 10 minutes.
Thank you, all of you. It's all fantastic to see you all here this morning and to be here in Burslem, the mother town of the potteries, where, where the spades first hit the ground in the construction of the great Trent and Mersey Canal, a fact which, of course, gives its name to Port Vale. Although, for me, if I'm honest, this is better known as the ground where Arsenal came really close to losing the double in 1998. This is true. 2 draws in the cup and a penalty shootout, very close penalty shootout, somewhere just over there. I went out to have a look at the pitch this morning to look at where those penalties were taken from. But look, today we are here on more serious business, as Yvette said, the launch of Labour's second national mission to make our streets safe and stop criminals getting away without punishment. Now, if you think that sounds basic, something which should be guaranteed in a country like ours, then let me tell you, you're right. Nothing is more important, more fundamental to a democracy like ours. The rule of law is the foundation for everything. Margaret Thatcher called it the first duty of government, and she was right about that. An expression of individual liberty, our rights and responsibilities, but also justice, fairness, equality. One rule for all. That's the principle I've been proud to serve all my adult life. As a human rights lawyer, fighting for families with young children, trying to escape mould-infested accommodation. Or for freedom of speech in the McLibel case. With the Police Service of Northern Ireland, advising them how to bring communities together to make the Good Friday Agreement work. And at the Crown Prosecution Service, as the Director of Public Prosecutions, the same principle. Everyone protected, everyone respected, no one denied the law, no one above the law. Not the murderers of Stephen Lawrence, who, for a time, thought that they were. Not Al-Qaeda terrorists. Not MPs, Labour or Conservatives, gaming the expenses system to line their pockets. I prosecuted them all, and I'm proud of that. One rule for all. And that's why I found the pandemic parties in Downing Street under Boris Johnson so reprehensible. The circus of the last few days. A reminder of his total disrespect for a national sacrifice. That's why I said I'd resign if I'd broken those same rules. I just couldn't have looked the British people in the eye and asked them for their trust. Those values are too important to me, the core of my politics today. So if the Tories want to attack me for being a human rights lawyer, attack the values I've stood up for my whole life, I say, fine. That only shows how far they have fallen and how little they understand working people. Because whatever the crime, antisocial behaviour, hate crime, serious violence, it's always working people who pay the heaviest price. Working class communities who have to live under its shadow. That's why tackling crime, law and order will always be important for my Labour Party. Fighting crime is a Labour cause. I grew up working class in a small town. I know how important it is to feel safe in your community. If you don't have a big house and a garden, the streets are where your kids play. Your community is your family, your neighbours, your eyes and ears. You have to feel a sense of trust, of confidence, of security. It's what gives you roots, a precondition of hope, the firm ground you can build your aspirations on. But as somebody who's worked in criminal justice for most of my life, I also know that far too often the inequalities that still scar our society, class, race, gender, do find an expression in the very system that is supposed to protect us all without discrimination. I've talked about this before, but the case that crystallised so much for me was the murder of a nurse called Jane Clough, stabbed to death in the car park of the Blackpool hospital where she worked. Killed by the man awaiting trial on multiple charges of raping her on the one morning she went to work unaccompanied. I will never forget the day her parents, John and Penny, came to my office and talked me through the awful treatment they had received from our criminal justice system. It's a moment that has shaped everything I've done since, everything I think about justice, how incomprehensible pain can only be met with practical action, that if you have the power and can do something for the powerless, you've got to roll up your sleeves, work night and day to make the changes, big and small, which can, if not put things right, then at least protect the future. That's what happened that day. As I listened to John and Penny tell me Jane's story, I knew a great injustice had been done. And I made a promise to work with them and make sure no other family would suffer the same fate. So together we changed the guidelines on rape cases in court. And crucially, we forced a change in the law that gave prosecutors the right to appeal against a bail decision. Changes which do give extra protection to women brave enough, like Jane, to place their faith in the system and press charges. But it isn't enough. I know that. In fact, it's why I decided to come into politics. Because the more and more case files I read, the more and more I could see those ugly inequalities at work. You saw it in grooming scandals like Rochdale as well. How good prosecutors and decent police officers, people who hated crime, would end up looking for the perfect victim, casting aspersions based on a way of thinking that was out of date, out of touch with the experience of victims and communities that they needed to serve. Why didn't you go to the police straight away? Why did you go back to them? Why didn't you put up a fight? Questions and assumptions that are deeply flawed and have left vulnerable people, working class women and girls especially, ignored, voiceless, denied justice. That's why the mission today matters to me. I'm proud of my previous work, proud of my record at the Crown Prosecution Service, but this is personal. Yes, it's Labour's plan to tackle the crime wave gnawing away at our collective sense of security. Of course it is. But it's also unfinished business in my life's work to deliver justice for working people.
Well, that was Keir Starmer, boring everybody to death in his usually inimitable way. Now, Sam Lister, you interviewed him in the Express today. He's talking about a 10-year pledge to sort out crime. 10 years?
It's a big ask, isn't it? I mean, his pitch is that actually, because of the cuts in police, in the 20,000 police officers that were cut
by Theresa May.
By Theresa May, that it's going to take a long time to kind of reverse that. When he spoke to me, he said that he wanted to be tough on grooming of children for crime. So he wants to make grooming a specific offence. So if you groom a child for crime, you can be done just for that alone. And that he wants to put bobbies outside the school gate to stop kids taking knives into schools.
We've had any of this before.
Yeah, but it was quite interesting. He used the phrase tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, obviously closely associate himself with Blair. And I said, well, look, a lot of your party don't like Blair. Why are you doing this? And he said, well, look, this is a core thing for me. Labour, crime is a Labour issue, he said, and it's personal for him as former director of public prosecutions.
How can he say crime is a Labour thing when Labour was in power? And let's just go back, to the Macpherson report of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. Labour was in power back then, and the Met Police was in disarray way back then, and they did nothing to correct it.
Who's in charge of the Metropolitan Police? So you don't hear much from him.
There you go.
Labour Mayor of London.
Yes, pretty hopeless.
Do you know? You've met Keir Starmer a few times.
Do you know, I've written the most unutterably bad things about him. I know you said something else there. I've written unutterably bad things, and every time I see him, he goes, "Hi, Carol." I'm expecting a bit of a slap, but he's just always utterly charming, and it makes me like him for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And then I hear that, and I think, no.
Now, we want to talk about Partygate.
Yeah, I do want to talk about Partygate.
Harriet Harman opened the proceedings yesterday saying, "We have not made our mind up." Oh, yes, she has.
She's had a cut and blow dry. Did you notice that? She had a very severe fringe cut. And she said that. She said, we've left our party politics at the door. I nearly choked. It's like so. She was hating him. She couldn't hide it. But I thought Boris was masterful, There was no bluff and bluster yesterday. There's no stumbling over what he was going to say. He was very respectful of Harriet Harman, at the same time saying to her, you have prejudiced this inquiry by what you have said about me. Because, of course, we all know about the famous tweet where she said, I feel he has broken the rules. So he gave her a slap right up front. I mean, he gave the whole committee a slap right up front. And I just thought, I was looking at that committee, this is a bunch... before I move off Harman, this is the woman. She wants her political legacy to be the woman who took Keir Starmer down once. Boris Johnson once and for all. And you can tell she's intent on that. But I was looking at that committee yesterday. What a bunch of non-entities they are. They're bringing down a prime minister. No, that he's brought down with the prime minister, but they're trying to bring down a man who got the biggest electoral landslide since Blair and Thatcher, probably. And I kind of looked at them together, and I thought, my God, there was a guy, an SNP guy from Ayr, who no one's ever heard of. There was somebody called Alberto Costa. No one's ever heard of him. And I'm just thinking, these guys they're non-entities, and yet they're there to bring down this guy. And they don't just want to bring him down; they want to crush him. And you can see that by their questions. What he said yesterday, I thought, was totally logical. All those photographs at the party. Why would you have Downing Street's official photographer taking photographs of something that you knew to be illegal? He was also told, which I thought was very funny, that he had said he had taken advice from senior advisors, and the committee suggested, well, he should have taken advice from even more senior advisors, because those ones clearly weren't right. So I just think this all boils down. I mean, I think the public perception of this is going to be, it boils down to whether you love Boris or you hate Boris. If you hate him because of what you think he did during the pandemic, people who lost people who couldn't get to hold the hands of a dying relative hate him, and that this is not going to change their minds. But I think people, if you listen to what he's actually saying, if you listen to the evidence, it makes logical sense to me that he did not know. He didn't purposely mislead them.
Sam, you've led obviously on this on the Express. It's your byline on the front page of the paper today. A lot of people will be walking... I was watching this when I was driving into work. Walking into work, they don't care, Sam. They don't care. I'm not saying that your newspaper hasn't got it right. Sorry, I'm not criticising your editorial expertise, but what I'm saying is I think people want to have the bigger questions answered. I want to see Hancock grilled like this about the lockdown. I want to see Boris grilled like this about lockdown. I'm not bothered about him being grilled about whether he was following the rules and then he maybe didn't tell the complete truth to them. I can't remember a time when the media is so detached from what the public are interested in.
Well, I think I totally take your point on that, and I think a lot of people think, why are we still going on about this? So so many months and years on. What the MPs would say is actually lying to Parliament is a really big deal. If you can't trust the Prime Minister to tell the truth to the Commons, and that is a big deal, and it should be dealt with. But I think, certainly for our readers are still angry about Boris being ousted. They felt it was a very small group of MPs who never wanted him there anyway, who got rid of him without any recourse to the wider
Sammy
party.
has apologised repeatedly from the dispatch box as Prime Minister for misleading Boris. There's no doubt he misled him.
Exactly.
It's just whether he did it recklessly, which is this new word that's entered the election.
Can I just ask Piers, because you know this more than probably all of us at this table, I think even if the Privilege Committee gives the punishment and it goes to Parliament has to vote on it. Isn't the feeling that the Tories will vote it down? They will not have him because they believe he's been treated unfairly, even the ones who don't like him.
My own instinct is that the committee will not recommend 10 days suspension. They'll go for maybe 4 or 5.
OK. It'll go to Parliament, and then
Parliament will get that through. I think he will be suspended then, but he won't face a by-election, and he bounces back.
Do you think he'll be suspended? I think the Tories will rally round him. I think
they might,
because I think they feel. I could be totally wrong, but I think even the ones who don't like him, I think they feel he's been badly treated.
Well, he's lost his job. He's not Prime Minister anymore.
But I think ultimately nobody actually, apart from a few hardcore MPs, really actually want him to face a 10-day suspension.
Yes.
That could potentially trigger a by-election. Then that just adds to the kind of martyrdom around him.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And the sense that he's been kind of unfairly treated. And so, that's not good. Rishi Sunak doesn't want a by-election in that constituency. He doesn't want to be out there having to campaign for Boris. So, it will split the party. So it's not really advantageous.
Do you think he'd win the by-election if there was one, Boris? I mean, do you think he'd win it?
It's very difficult to win a by-election if you're an incumbent. And the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats almost certainly put up a shadow candidate, so it would be Boris against a Labour candidate.
Oh, OK.
Although, of course, the Lib Dems have chosen somebody as their candidate whose father died during the same week as one of the lockdown parties. Cynical or what?
But it is a waste of money, isn't it? What's this costing? 500 grand? And I think Boris should absolutely have it paid for. Tony Blair got the Iraq inquiry paid for by the public, so why not this? But I do think I think you're totally right, Bev. It's a waste of time. I think the public have moved on, actually, and they want to be talking about the things that bother them today.
I think about Gwyneth Paltrow.
Oh, I don't want to. I do. Yes, I do.
Done?
Well, she's in court this week, and she's being sued by this bloke. He's a retired eye surgeon, and apparently, like 8 years ago, he says she crashed into him like King Kong on a green slope. Now, I'm not a big skier. I'm not a skier at all, in fact, but a green slope I know is a baby slope. So I don't know where she was coming out of like King Kong. I mean, according to other people, she was watching her kids learning to ski. However, the man has taken 8 years to bring this to court. He first of all asked for $3 million. Now he's asking for 245 grand. He's lowered his thing. And he's saying that he couldn't work after it. He's saying he had a bit of brain damage. But it's her that I'm fascinated by, OK? So the girls, you won't get this, or you might. She's coming into court in, like, cream cashmere jumpers. And the American... What do they call it? They call it, she's channeling, what is it called? Rich mom energy. and the cashmere jumpers are 800 quid a time. The coach is wearing it to court, it's like 4 grand. But she's sitting there trying to be warm and cosy, because why wouldn't she settle? 245 grand for her is nothing. She charges 60 quid for one of our orgasmic candles. So it's 200 on her Goop website. But I'm thinking, is this not just great publicity for Goop? This is 8 days?
This is
Do you think?
exactly what I think, because how has this ended up in court?
Yes.
How has this ended up in court?
She could have settled it easily.
8 years. And as Karen says, 245,000. She earns that in a blink.
Yeah, these superstar celebrities just pay people off. So the fact it's actually got to court makes me very suspicious.
And she says that it was the other way round and that he actually skied into her. Maybe she's just doing it from a sense of justice.
I think no. I don't have that kind of faith in Hollywood.
You're very cynical, Carol.
Yeah, I learned it from you, Piers. But I just do think, why would you want the fuss of it? Why would you want all the mess of it? And I just think, she's playing this game. I mean, we've seen celebrities. When Amber Heard went into court, suited.
But that
booted
backfired on
looking.
her big time.
Well, I don't know if it was the suit that backfired on her, but you know, a lot of women go into court and they're looking like serious.
Nigella. I mean, Nigella was a great example of how to kind of power dress for a trial and look, you know, serene and I'm rising above this and I've got my beautiful coat on and I'm being all, you know, so I think,
Gwyneth looks like she's in the backyard having a barbecue with her kids.
But what I like about her, though, when you see Gwyneth Paltrow, she's not a face, she's not messed around, she's not full of fillers, she's very natural still. We were looking at her in the papers yesterday, weren't we, and saying she looks a bit different, and we realised she only looks different because she doesn't look like all the other Hollywood plastic
she
women.
looks ordinary, And I looked at it from the side and thought she looked like she was ageing a bit, but that's all right.
Imagine.
I was glad.
Cara Vorderman the other day.
It's aging a bit. Right, still to come, we're going to be talking about Boris Johnson fighting on after this grilling by the Privileges Committee yesterday. More on that and tons more. Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stumped.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Very good morning. Welcome to The Point on GB News with me, Bev Turner, and Andrew Pearce.
Well, Boris Johnson, he was in fighting form, wasn't he, yesterday? He says he didn't mislead Parliament. We'll find out what the committee thinks in a few months' time, but we want to know what you think. Was it worth it? Do you believe him? Do you care?
Yeah, let us know. GB Views at gbnews.uk. Also, Rishi Sunak saw off a backbench revolt by Tory hardliners yesterday, opposed to his Brexit deal with Northern Ireland. Is Brexit finally done?
And it's 3 years to the day since Boris locked us down. COVID. We're going to be talking about that. It was to keep us safe from the coronavirus. What, if any, lessons have been learnt?
Also, the US Federal Reserve has raised interest rates by 1/4 of a point, increasing the likelihood that the Bank of England will do the same today. The move comes amid a shock rise in inflation to 10.4%. We will bring you the official decision here in the UK as it happens.
That's it. you think with all those stories by emailing us to the usual place, gbviews@gbnews.uk.
First of all, let's bring you up to date with what's happening around the world with Rhiannon Jones.
Bev, thank you. Good morning. It's 2 minutes past 11, your top stories from the GB newsroom. Sir Keir Starmer has promised to crack down on serious violent crime in England and Wales if Labour win the next general election. It's after the Conservatives accused them of being soft on crime. Sir Keir has pledged to halve levels of violence against women and girls within a decade. He's also announced his party's plan to raise confidence in the police following a damning report into the Met. The Bank of England is widely expected to raise the interest base rate for the 11th time in a row later. Economists are predicting a hike from 4 to 4.25 percentage points. The bank faces a balancing act between reining in inflation and ensuring financial stability. It comes after a surprise rise in inflation to 10.4% last month and the decision by the US Federal Reserve to raise its key rate overnight. AJ Bell's head of financial analysis, Danny Hewson, says another rise will put yet more pressure on people already struggling with the cost of living crisis.
The Bank of England has to demonstrate that it is really serious about bringing prices down, because for ordinary people, those high prices are just eye-watering at the moment. They're causing a huge amount of harm. When you go shopping, you're having to pay a little bit more every time, and a lot of budgets just can't stretch any further.
And we'll have full coverage of the Bank of England's decision here on GB News from midday. The UK and Welsh governments have announced 2 free ports will be created in Wales for the first time in a bid to boost the country's economy. The Celtic and Anglesey free ports in North Wales are expected to attract almost £5 billion in investment. It's also hoped they'll generate up to 20,000 jobs by the end of the decade. Rishi Sunak has paid more than £1 million in tax over the last 3 years. The Prime Minister's published his long-awaited personal tax documents. They reveal he paid £432,000 in tax in the last financial year. It follows his commitment he first made during his Tory leadership campaign last summer. When asked if he could understand what it's like for people struggling to heat their homes, Mr. Sunak said he's on the people's side.
Ultimately, what people are interested in is what I'm going to do for them. And, you talk about the cost of living. Of course, that's the number one priority that I'm grappling with. That's why last year we took a decision to tax the windfall profits of energy companies. We're taxing them at 75%, and we're using that money to help pay people's energy bills. So over the course of this winter and beyond, we're going to be paying about £1,500 of most people's energy bills. That's the type of support we're providing to help people, and that should give people a sense that I am on their side. I'm doing everything I can to help them.
A man has been charged with 2 counts of attempted murder after 2 elderly men were set alight outside mosques in Birmingham and London. Mohammed Abkar from Edgbaston in Birmingham is appearing at Coventry Magistrates Court. The 28-year-old is alleged to have sprayed the 2 victims before setting them alight in separate incidents. 70-year-old Mohammed Rayaz remains in hospital with severe burns to his face, hands and chest following Monday's attack in Birmingham. The Prince of Wales will speak with Ukrainian refugees and pay tribute to the inspiring humanity of the Polish people. On the second day of his surprise visit to the country, Prince William laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Warsaw. He says the trip will allow him to thank troops and underline his support for the people of Poland. Nicola Sturgeon will face her final First Minister's questions shortly after more than 8 years as head of the Scottish Government. She announced last month she was stepping down from her role, saying she no longer had the stamina to carry on in the pressured and demanding role. The First Minister had said she'd remain in office until her successor is chosen. And Sir Jim Ratcliffe and Sheikh Jassim are both expected to submit second improved bids to buy Manchester United after the deadline was extended. A cut-off of 9 p.m. last night had initially been set for the Ineos owner and Qatari banker, the only bidders to have gone public. A first round of bidding took place last month, and it's understood there are as many as 8 other potential investors. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, it's back to Andrew and Beth.
Welcome back. It's 11:06. So Boris Johnson could face a formal reprimand if he's found to have recklessly misled Parliament following the Partygate scandal.
If he's suspended from the Commons, that would lead to a by-election in his Uxbridge seat, which could and would, I think, be the end of his political career. Well, watching it yesterday was our very own political correspondent, Olivia Utley. He did all right, didn't he?
I think he did just about all right. It definitely wasn't the sort of catastrophe that some of his detractors were hoping for. On some issues, it sounded like he was on pretty strong ground. So the committee was trying to build this argument that it should have been obvious to him that rules were being broken. And he rebuffed that with a pretty logical argument that if it was so obvious that rules were being broken, then why would an official number 10 photographer be along at the events? He also did quite a good job of sort of lumping himself in with civil servants and, as he rather castily said, the current Prime Minister, essentially saying, well, if it was obvious to him, well, shouldn't it have been obvious to them as well? I thought he was on the shakiest ground and he seemed the most ruffled when he was being questioned on why he failed to set the record straight after he'd stood up and said that all the rules had been followed. The committee seemed prepared to accept that he'd made those comments sort of in the heat of the moment and in good faith. But then why hadn't he gone to a parliamentary lawyer, for example, to sort of get a belt and braces answer for whether he had told the full truth? So I think, as you suggested in those opening comments there, I think it'll be quite difficult for them to prove that he deliberately misled Parliament. But this charge of recklessly misleading, not doing everything that he could have done to set the record straight...
Which is a lower bar, isn't it?
Which is a lower bar and could mean... I mean, my instinct is, and I say this very cautiously, that it's possible that as it is a lower bar, it could result in a suspension, but not a 10-day suspension.
Yeah, that's my hunch.
And it's only a 10-day suspension that would result in the recall petition.
But if they say they recommend 5 days or 4 days, whatever it is, Olivia, it then goes to a vote on the floor of the House of Commons. The Tories will not be whipped, because that's what Rishi says. Would Tory MPs vote to suspend their former Prime Minister? We know a lot of them hate him.
Well, that'll be really interesting. I mean, there's a lot at play here because, yes, plenty of them hate him. And you could see from the very small rebellion on the Windsor framework yesterday that he doesn't hold that much sway within the party. On the other hand, a by-election in Uxbridge is the last thing the Tories need.
Disastrous.
And the majority is only around 7,000. And if it got to by-election stage, then it seems pretty likely that Boris Johnson would lose it. And so it might be cutting off their noses to spite their faces to vote to suspend Boris Johnson if it would result in the end of his parliamentary career. If it resulted in a short suspension, then I think it's quite likely that they would vote to accept the recommendation of the committee.
That's what I think will happen. But that's still pretty humiliating for a former Prime Minister to be suspended, even for a day or two.
Well, absolutely. And I think that even if it doesn't result in a suspension, I think that the sort of unedifying spectacle yesterday could well mean the end of his frontline career in politics. Presumably, he wants to find a way back to frontline politics. But these sort of assertions that a leaving party was necessary for work purposes, well, maybe trying to persuade the committee that he genuinely believed that is quite a good sort of quasi-legal defence and might get him off on a technicality. But it doesn't play well in the country where people were missing funerals, weddings, etc., because they felt that they weren't able to do it. They felt that the rules precluded them from doing it. So I don't think it played well, whatever the technical outcome of this committee is.
There's nobody, you see, there's nobody. It's very difficult to back Boris Johnson now, because if you lost somebody with COVID, you are furious with him because he wasn't obeying the rules that you were very closely observing. And if you didn't, but you were very anti-lockdown, you're furious with him for making the rules in the first place. And there was a sort of satisfaction in seeing him hoisted by his own petard yesterday. It was like, I did enjoy, Olivia, the fact that it was holding up a mirror to how ludicrous some of these measures were in the theatre. So when he actually said, you know, they said, did you move into each other's orbit? Well, we probably did move into each other's orbit.
Exactly. Or Tim Stanley made the same point in his Telegraph analysis this morning. It did suggest, well, of course we weren't able to have a 2-metre force field around people all the time. Well, yes. So why did you put that rule in the first place?
And we didn't swap pens, but we did exchange
pass
glasses.
Drinks. Yes, of course we did.
Alcohol drinks.
Words.
Well, you're not really supposed to be drinking alcohol. I mean, Is it Harriet Harman, of course, chaired it. It's her last hurrah for her. She's standing down at the next election. Carol Malone made the point, and I agree with her. Harriet Harman would like nothing better than her legacy to be to depose, topple Boris Johnson to get him out of Parliament once and for all.
Yeah, I agree. But
she did not leave her politics at the door. She can't. She thinks and breathes, how do I damage the Tories? That's Harriet.
I think that's true, but I don't think she did I think on the whole she was fairer than perhaps some would have expected. It wasn't a sort of Harriet Harman show. And I think that Boris's assertions that the committee was very biased and prejudged, I'm not sure if they hit home quite as much as some of his supporters were hoping that they would.
He did to say also he didn't accept the criticism by some of his friends that it was a kangaroo court. He didn't use that expression. He actually pulled back from that.
He did, and that was a pretty awkward moment because, of course, that's what Jacob Rees-Mogg had come out and said. So the committee had him on a bit of a sticky wicket there. But yeah, he did draw away from
prediction,
that.
What happens, the committee,
I
after
mean,
the local elections?
Very cautious prediction that he will be suspended, but it won't be a 10-day suspension. The Commons will vote for that suspension. It'll be a slap on the wrist. But I think we probably have seen the end of Boris Johnson as a frontline politician.
I think that's probably right.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you so much. You've been getting in touch. Jill has said, we loved lockdown. Everywhere was quiet. When you went out for a walk, it was peaceful. The air smelt better with no vehicles. We want it back. We want it back again. I just do not get why so many people were unable to cope. Well, lucky you, Jill. Lucky you. The vast majority of people don't feel like that. And Tony says these restrictions were not for the good of the country. It was an exercise in compliance.
And Richard says, hindsight's a wonderful thing. That's true, of course, Richard. Just ask Keir Starmer, had there been no lockdown and a further 1 million people had died, what would your conversation have been about today? We'll never know. Time to move on.
Well, we do know, because Sweden didn't lock down and they've got better mortality rates than us.
Mustn't forget, of course, there is to be a formal public inquiry, and I think it starts in April. They're already doing formative steps already, but I guarantee you it won't report before the next general election. It'll probably be 5 or 6 years.
And it will be a whitewash.
Iraq inquiry, 2013. When was the Iraq war? 2003. Bloody Sunday, 40 years.
Yeah, awful. The amount of taxpayers' money spent on these things keeps me awake at night. Anyway, let us know what you think. gbviews@gbnews.uk. So, as we have been discussing this morning, today marks 3 years since Britain went into that first national lockdown.
Boris Johnson said he was locking us down with the intention of keeping families safe, saying, quote, the critical thing we must do is to stop the disease spreading between households. Of course, he was following an international consensus, and we locked down slower, of course, than the Labour Party wanted.
He was following the Chinese Communist Party. But as we look back at that time, what was a tough time for businesses and families, what lessons have we learnt as a nation? Well, joining us now, co-founder of Together Association, Alan Miller. Good morning, Alan. I think it's fair to say that your life is completely different now than it was 3 years ago today. How?
Well, good morning. It's different in so many ways because it looks like the new normal seems to be a concentration of the idea that technocrats of whatever colour, whether it's the people who weren't elected, that many of the members didn't actually want, who are currently in the government, or the opposition who wanted even more impositions, longer and harder. The new normal seems to be, when in doubt, regulate, restrict, nudge, fear, tell the public, be quiet, we know what's best for you, and we're going to do it regardless, undemocratically. Whether that happens to be Sadiq Khan with ULEZ, whether it happens to be 15 and 20-minute cities or low-traffic neighbourhoods, funded by a central government, implemented by local authorities. And frankly, this charade with what's going on with Boris Johnson at the moment, when we should have been looking at why we should never have done it in the first place, like Anders Tegnell has done in Sweden. Many people have been disrupted, over 7 million waiting on the NHS, cost of lockdown crisis, impacts across families and education. We see all the destruction and the damages. And I think that the public are fed up with being sidelined and treated with contempt. And actually, now people are organised. So at the Together Association, the Together Declaration, we're launching a new cabinet that will put the government under pressure and the opposition and say, let's put the public at the heart of things, not technocrats.
You formed the Together Association as a result of lockdown. Just tell us what it is, the association, and the sort of organisations that are supporting you, Alan, because it's a pretty big alliance.
Yes, indeed. So we launched on so-called Freedom Day, that Orwellian term when Boris Johnson said, oh, by the way, it's Freedom Day and we're going to have vaccine passports. We work with all sorts of people like Us for Them that campaign for children not to have to wear masks in schools. We work with people like the Free Speech Union. Our pillars around fundamental freedoms, the freedom of speech, freedoms to the right to congregate and protest, pillars around no lockdowns ever again, no restrictions without a cost-benefit analysis. So no suspending parliamentary scrutiny and ensuring transparency and open debate, and particularly about putting the public at the heart of things. So not being told that the markets need this or we must do that because it's this crisis or that emergency, but thinking calmly and rationally about what we need. Local, regional and national democratic accountability where the public is at the heart of things. So people can see that at togetherdeclaration.org.
Alan, people must be listening to this and thinking, oh, well, this guy must have been in politics for years. He must have been a local councillor, or he must have been having political ambitions of his own this time 3 years ago. How true is that?
Entirely untrue. Frankly, I've been involved in, the nighttime sector, bars, clubs, entertainment. Nothing would have been further from the truth. Actually, I would have been much happier to have carried on being able to do that. I think the thing is, it's a bit like that moment, here I stand, I can do no other. I mean, I do think that anyone who is serious about the kind of society we want to live in and freedoms and watch what's happened in the last 3 years, although many of the trends have been there for the last couple of decades, but the last 3 years, there is a different way. It doesn't have to be just this thing we're presented with. There's an opportunity for you to have your voices heard, to get involved and to hold elected representatives accountable. And if they can't do it, they should step out of the way. And we need to re-energize this idea that the public is at the heart of things and we have democracy properly and truly, because we're seeing so many measures that are really, really anti-public, that are anti-freedom. And we should remember that this experiment of the last 300 years that we have is not the same everywhere. Lockdowns, China, you look at many places around the world, they don't have the kind of respect for our fundamental rights and freedoms. And that's why anyone who thinks it's important that we uphold this legacy and defend that so many people fought and died for, freedom of speech, freedom of protest, should get involved with us and make sure that as the new emergency or crisis we keep being told about comes down the line each time, we're told we have to do this, be quiet, sit in the corner, put your hands on the heads, that we say, well, why and how come? And despite the smears, when people like to smear and silence and censor, and we've seen it with the government organisations to spy on citizens, we've seen it with the Twitter files, in spite of all of that, that we say, no, actually, we're not going to have this. We demand and insist on a free approach that puts us at the heart of things, and we're not going to be treated with contempt anymore.
All right, thank you, Alan. Out of bad comes good. Honestly, if you like what Alan says there about the Together Association, look them up online and join it. They're having to self-fund and they're doing just the most amazing work. You can hear the passion with which he speaks.
Now, it's 20 years, of course, since Britain sided with the US to invade Iraq. Do you think we were right to do so? We're going to be talking to a Tory MP who was a soldier in the first Iraq War and a journalist in the second.
You're with GB News.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat.
Did you know,
All
Kate
sorts of
Moss?
rumors. Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Good morning, it's 11:22. You're with Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce on GB News. This is To The Point.
So we're going to find out very soon, Bank of England, are they going to raise interest rates today? I rather feel they will. Liam Halligan, who is our fabulous economics editor, he is outside the Bank of England. Liam, what do you think?
You say all the right things, Andrew. It will be at midday that we'll find out whether or not the Bank of England's going for its 11th successive interest rate rise from 4%. Probably, if it happens, to 4.25%. Bad news if you're on a variable rate mortgage or you've got other variable rate loans. Pretty good if you're a saver. If, and it's a big if sometimes, the banks pass those interest rate rises on to savers. The Bank of England behind me really is on the horns of a dilemma. There are 9 economists on its Monetary Policy Committee that decides interest rates, including the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey. On the one hand, we've just seen inflation surprisingly go up from 10.1 to 10.4%, the latest figure for February, which came out earlier this week. On the other hand, do they really want to raise interest rates? Because that could rattle financial markets and unearth some more of those banking jitters that we want to avoid, 2008 style panics. It's difficult, but at least as far as the Bank of England's concerned, if it does want to raise rates, the mighty Federal Reserve, the US central bank, raised its interest rates yesterday. Inflation in the US is much lower, so if the US has raised its interest rates, I think the Bank of England, in all probability, will follow suit, Andrew.
Liam, I know you're not an independent financial advisor and that's a slightly different job, but let me ask you this one question within the realms of your your significant powers. We see these interest rate rises, you mentioned there. Why aren't many banks passing those on in savings accounts? Is that completely at their discretion as to whether they do so?
It is at their discretion because it's a marketplace. And guess what? Our banking sector, certainly in terms of the high street banks, isn't very competitive. There's a smaller number of banks than there used to be, so they don't have to pass the rate rises on. Another reason is that a lot of banks have lost money because they've bought government bonds. The price of those bonds has fallen as interest rates have risen, weakened their balance sheets. So on the one hand, the Bank of England's raising interest rates. Banks should be offering more interest rates benefits to savers. On the other hand, the banks will say that their balance sheets are weak. Look, in the end, it comes down to competition. And one of the big problems, in my view, is that our high street banking sector isn't very competitive. So consumers don't always get the best deal.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Thank you, Liam. Thanks so much. My mortgage is up for renewal at the moment.
Oh, that's not good.
And I'm in a massive dilemma about whether I go on a fixed rate now or a variable rate. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that. And I genuinely don't know what to do.
Well, because inflation is going to fall, we thought. It was meant to be coming down to, what was it, 2.9%, but it actually went up last month, so who knows. Now, it's the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. Tony Blair led us into that conflict with the United States. We're joined now, I'm delighted to say, by the Conservative MP and former Army officer, Adam Holloway, who served in the first Gulf War and in the second Gulf War was a journalist. Adam, morning to you. Most people would now say the Gulf War was a terrible mistake by the British government.
Well, of course it was. I mean, not just in terms of the British lives lost, but also in terms of the Iraqi population, the Iraqi civilian population. I mean, I remember a couple of years after the war, flying in a helicopter from the airport into the Green Zone in Baghdad, and this just flying very low over the rooftop, just this tragic sight underneath of streets kind of blocked off with cars and barricades, and literally neighbours just protecting their neighbourhoods, because we unleashed unimaginable insecurity because basically we had no idea what we were doing when the war ended.
That was one of the big criticisms, wasn't it, Adam, that there was no full planning about what came after the war. The dictator was toppled, executed, but no democracy took its place.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I was sort of one of the first people into the city of Mosul when it collapsed, and I went in sort of early in the morning, and there were bodies on the streets of sort of Saddam people who'd been killed. There were American jets coming low. There was just anarchy, looting. I remember all this crowd of people just wheeling incubators out of a hospital, looting stuff. And anyway, I went to the Iraqi sort of police general, a load of Saddam lookalikes, and he said to me, look, if you're seeing the Americans, which I was about to go and do, he said, can you get them to come up here to, give me my instructions as to, what they want us to do, which was an astonishing thing in itself for an Iraqi general to say. And I went down and I found this American colonel. I did my business with him. And I said, look, the Iraqi Saddam lookalike wants to see you to know what you guys want them to do. And he said, you can tell him to go and F himself. And at that point, I realized that we had a real problem emerging. And then, of course, we de-Baathificated. So we took everyone who'd been in Saddam's party out. So you basically removed from jobs the entire army and police force, pretty much. So guess what? We had anarchy, and it was our fault. I mean, we just did not think this through. But the people who paid the price were British and coalition troops, but mostly the Iraqi civilian population.
Adam, I don't know where you are today, but that looks very much like a portrait of Saddam Hussein behind you. Is that correct? Is that your house?
This is indeed my house, yes. I'm looking after it for a friend. How shall I put it?
OK, and so what? Just to tell our viewers, what would be the significance for you of having that picture on the wall in the house?
So it was really interesting. I mean, I was in the war in 1991, but then I was back as a correspondent in 2003. And it was really interesting because as I drove through Iraq, with some of your colleagues, indeed, and we finally made it to Saddam's hometown, and I realized that there was not a single intact picture of Saddam because the population had just smashed them as soon as they were able to. The only intact picture I found was in his secret police headquarters in his home city of Tikrit, that, on day one, day two, the civilian population was still far too terrified to go into. So, I look at a picture of Saddam and I think, this guy was an A1, however you want to put it, a killer, a dictator, et cetera, But the truth is, and I make no apology for his rule, but he kept the balance between Sunni and Shia. And what happened in our massive neocon ignorance, we went in there and we smashed down the existing structures, as we were later to do in Afghanistan. And we know from both these wars that really didn't work very well. And as I've said twice already, the people who paid were coalition troops, but mostly the civilian populations of these countries. I mean, the whole thing's just been a tragedy and a disaster.
And Adam, we could take you to Libya too. Britain and France got involved there. Gaddafi was toppled. Is Libya in a better place? It's a complete basket case. And do you think, Adam, if I could ask you as well, the Iraq war, is it responsible for the huge conflict and terrorism that we've seen as a result in the Middle East in the last 20 years?
Of course it is. Look, on 9/11, there were lots of pictures of people burning American flags and things in the Middle East. But actually, the reality was that I would say the vast majority of the Muslim world were, deeply sympathetic to the tragedy that had befallen those poor people in the Twin Towers and on those planes, including many Muslims. And at the time, Al-Qaeda were these crazy people crying out there in the wilderness and out there on cyberspace, saying that the Americans and the West wanted to kill Muslims and steal their natural resources. Well, guess what? Those neocons' reaction, totally out of proportionate reaction to the event, not out of proportion, but incorrect reaction to the events of 9/11, actually reinforced bin Laden's narrative that the West wanted to kill Muslims and take their natural resources. So what we did is it was like a cancer. Rather than cut the cancer out, we smashed it and we put little bits of it right across the world. And that's what we're still paying the price for now.
Fascinating, fascinating. Adam Holloway, I could have talked to you all day. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Conservative MP for Gresham, he's great, isn't he? He fought in the First War, saw it there as a journalist too, and he's on the right side of the argument because that war was a wicked, terrible mistake.
Right, still to come, more than half of Britons believe that their smartphones are spying on them. Only half? We'll find out after the news with Rihanna.
Good morning, it's 11:32, your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Bank of England's widely expected to raise the interest base rate for the 11th time in a row. Economists are predicting a hike from 4 to 4.25 percentage points. The bank faces a balancing act between reining in inflation and ensuring financial stability. It comes after a surprise rise in inflation to 10.4% last month and the decision by the US Federal Reserve to raise its key rate overnight. We'll have full coverage of the Bank of England's decision here on GB News in the next half hour. Sir Keir Starmer has promised to make Britain's streets safe again if Labour wins the next general election. He's pledged 4 targets to modernise British policing in England and Wales in the next 10 years. They include halving levels of violence against women and girls and knife crime. It's after the Conservatives accuse Labour of being soft on crime.
Confidence is everything. It's what effective, visible, open-minded policing can provide for the communities that it serves. And as we've seen this week, it's what bad policing destroys. So let me be very clear. The next Labour government will modernise British policing.
Sir Keir also said he'll aim to publish his tax returns later on today. That's after the Prime Minister published his yesterday. Rishi Sunak's accounts show he paid more than £1 million in tax over the last 3 years. And the Prince of Wales has laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Warsaw. On the second day of his surprise visit to Poland, Prince William's spoken with Ukrainian refugees and paid tribute to the inspiring humanity of the Polish people. He says the trips allowed him to thank troops and underline his support for Poland. TV online, DAB, digital and TuneIn radio. This is GB News. Now it's back to Bev and Andrew.
Good morning. So Rishi Sunak, as of yesterday, I didn't know that until you said that this morning. It passed me by with all the news going on, but that was probably the point, right? Rishi Sunak published his tax returns. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer says he's going to publish his today. More on that in a bit.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The people's channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Michael Portillo. Join me on GB News on a Sunday morning for topical discussion, debate, arts and culture, and sometimes even ethical dilemmas.
I don't always agree with you, Michael.
Michael Portillo, Sundays on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning, it's 11:38. Andrew Pearce, stop nattering with Carol Malone.
Sorry.
You're on the telly.
Gossiping,
I am. I'm giving
because that's what she does.
Right, Sam Lister's also here. We were being much more behaved on this side of the table, weren't we, Sam?
Swatty girls on this side.
We knew we were on the telly. Right, what we're talking about first, Carol, inflation frenzy. Are we?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
okay,
I don't know. Pick a topic.
Let's do that because
it's the end of the week.
So, this is good because the Bank of England rate is due to go up today. This by 0.25%. We think this is to combat because inflation has gone up, and they're saying it's unexpectedly because they're saying it's because of the food, the rise in food prices, vegetables particularly a couple of weeks ago. Now, this is going to hit households really hard because they were told a few days ago they were going to save 500 quid a year. Now that the energy price has gone down a little bit, this is going to take it away again because this is going to be on an average mortgage, 150 grand. That's going to be an extra 375 a year. So that's eating up the saving they had in the energy. So it's going to hurt them. But I don't know what you guys think, but I'm looking at what's happening in supermarkets and it's making me furious.
Me too.
Because I think they're profiteering. I don't believe that prices going up by 25, 28% is to do with any
And
profit.
don't you suspect it's a cartel?
I think it's a cartel. Lidl and Aldi, they're the ones that have gone up the most because they have the most, they're the cheapest to start with, 25%. Aldi and then 22 thing. The rest of the average is 16%. You go to buy a tub of butter now, you need a mortgage for it. It's like £5 something. And I'm thinking, my God. So they are profiteering. I think the government has to put a shot across their bows, actually.
Well, they've done it with banks. But supermarkets are much more powerful.
They are, and we know historically that the supermarkets have got huge amounts of power. And poor farmers. There was the big kind of milk
Try and
price
sell your milk
fixing.
to them.
Yeah, it's really difficult because obviously there's a few small number of big supermarkets, and they really control what we pay.
You've got a thing in your paper today, Sam, talking about the extent to which this is affecting people's mental health. I mean, it sounds an exaggeration. We use that phrase, don't we, a bit too liberally these days, mental health. But it's really stressful trying to shop for the kids.
It is, and if you're on a fixed income and the price is just going up and up every time you go through your shop, you're worrying that when you get to the till, are you actually going to have enough to cover the bill? And that is incredibly stressful for people.
And of course, a lot of people, particularly older people, have savings. But isn't it funny that the mortgage rate always goes up really quickly? The credit card rate goes up really quickly, but the saving rates on your account goes up very, very slowly.
But they're also saying as well that this hike might also mean that fuel prices are going to go up as well. Now, they've just come down a bit. We've all just they've come down by a few pennies. They're going to shoot up again, not unnecessarily, I think. But I just think we're getting ripped off all ends and sides.
We are, aren't we?
And everyone can say, oh, it's the cost of
And we feel powerless, don't we?
Yeah.
That's the trouble.
And we've got MPs yesterday grilling the former Prime Minister for 3 hours. What people watching this programme are really concerned about is the cost of living crisis.
Of course, yeah. I mean, we know. Well, Boris thing's over.
And two people who aren't going to be bothered by the cost of living crisis, of course, Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. So yesterday, Sunak released his tax returns. So, as a result, Keir Starmer's now going to do his, Sam. He should have done it first if he wanted to gain political capital from it, shouldn't he?
Yeah, possibly, but I suspect his may be more boring. So, but, you know, obviously we have this very interesting time in buying Number 10. It's that we've been asking them for months, when are you going to put out these tax returns that you've promised? And every day we get this kind of, oh, it'll be soon. And then what do we see on the day of Boris Johnson being grilled, the big Brexit vote? There's all these other things going on. They try and slip this out now.
What was the expression famous here? A good day to bury bad news.
Exactly, yeah.
Because, of course, he did pay a lot of tax.
Yeah.
He paid in tax what most of us dream of earning in an entire lifetime. Yeah. And he paid that in 1 year. But why would he think he would get away with this?
Well, he's got to do it at some point. So
but the transparency, it's so obvious what he's doing. It didn't go on the front pages, did it? It wasn't leading the broadcast news last night. But the other thing that I think we've got to defend people who are rich and successful going into public life and political life. We shouldn't be concerned that Rishi Sunak is so rich. But, of course, the criticism Labour make is, all the time, how can he have any comprehension of people struggling to pay the supermarket I don't mind if a politician is rich, as long as he's smart and he knows what he's doing. Or she. And you know, Sunak has proved he's a smart guy. He came to this country with not very much, and he's made a fortune. And I think that's fine. But Labour's attack on him always it's about his money, it's about the price of his coffee cup, it's about the price of his trainers. They're talking about how expensive his suits are. Well, what do they expect the guy? Should he wear a suit from, you know, I don't know, Marks, a 90-quid suit from Marks, as opposed to the one he can afford? No, of course he shouldn't. But by the same token, he should, you know, I think he's doing OK, and I never thought I'd say that. I think he's doing OK at the moment,
Sam, they seem to have got their act together in the last few weeks.
There's been a significant shift in the last few weeks where actually everyone was a bit like, what is this guy about? We don't really hear from him, we never really see him. What is he about? And then in the last few weeks with the Brexit deal, with
Stop the boats.
Stop the boats.
Popular.
Yeah, hugely popular. And, you know, people starting to say, hang on a minute, you know, is he actually...
Yeah, and I saw a poll somewhere today suggesting that people are using the incompetence of the Tory government in the past tense. So people now sense that things are getting
Is there enough time, though, Piers, before the election?
The election is next October or November, I would think.
But I think if you've got people in the red wall who voted for Boris, they generally don't want to vote for Starmer. So if Rishi is a viable alternative, you know, who knows, they may well. And if he does manage to stop the votes or significantly bring down the numbers, that will be the big...
And if he does that, he'll get the red wall back, which
it's a game changer, I think.
Yes, it's completely a game changer.
I think it's the #1 issue, along with the cost of living.
I think it is. I mean, you know, the Labour are trying to stop him at every turn, as are all the human rights lawyers and everyone else. But this feels a little bit different to me. This kind of... You know, every time I talk to people, they say, oh, the Rwanda planes are never going to go off, it's never going to happen. But actually, I have a feeling it just might. Especially this week when they said that they would ignore the rulings of the ACHR.
Right. So, you know, we all have those suspicions when you're sort of sitting chatting to your mum about kitchen tiles, and then next thing your phone puts your adverts about kitchen tiles, and you go, how did that happen? Has it literally read my mind? Well, it turns out, no, it's just listening to you, and it is snooping on you. What's going on, Sam? 50% of people said they suspected that the phones were listening to them.
Yeah, honestly, and I am totally convinced this is happening. I have all my settings on the highest privacy settings. I'm really paranoid about all this stuff. And actually, I'm always having this happen to me. And we've got my partner and I, we have separate computer accounts. Like, we're not linked in any way on our computers. Yeah, I know when he is shopping for a new pair of shoes because the adverts pop on.
Well, just be grateful that's all he's looking at.
So, and then I find that really sinister. And I say, oh, have you been looking at shoes again? And he's like, how do you know? And I'm like, because all your adverts are popping up on my computer.
This is why I don't understand why people do this Alexa thing. Why do you want this Alexa to
You know how old you sound?
You know how old you sound? Because I am old, but not quite as old as you.
No one's as old as me. I'm as old as God. But there's a thing in this part which says, this is why so many apps ask for the user's permission to access the microphone. Now, when I read that today, I mean, I understand that. You will have no clue what that means because you don't have any apps, do you? No, OK. But that makes sense as well, that they can listen if you have your microphone on.
Yeah.
It's terrifying.
I'm always seeing that thing, it's about cookies. When you hit that thing about cookies, what does it mean?
It just means exactly they can track everything you're doing and then give you the adverts.
So you should say no to cookies.
Yes.
Correct.
But
all
life
the
is
time.
too short.
Reject all.
And then it will make it difficult for you. Then in the effort of under the guise of convenience, we just press accept more.
You know, it is sad actually that you are so good at a lot of things, but you are just terrible at technology.
And my partner is much the same.
Yeah, no, your partner's much better than you, love.
Yeah.
But you know what? The drive of tech is... I was chatting to a guy in the pub on Friday night. Lovely Gary. He has no bank account. He has no email. He has no internet. He has no smartphone. He's only 65. And he said, I can no longer really function.
No,
I can't drive
exactly.
into the local town with my car because I can't pay for it on a
course.
phone. And he said, and I was obviously open-mouthed and going, you've not even got a bank account. And he said, there are millions of us.
Don't say that, because I tried to do an app on a parking thing the other week. Seriously, I had to get a passerby.
And also, these banks want to get rid of cash.
They do.
And we've got to resist it. I use cash a lot.
See, I don't use cash. I don't use cash. But I really think we need to protect cash, because actually... a lot of... I certainly know my dad is cash-only man, where, you know, on the whole, and he despairs at me never having any cash. But a lot of people are cash-only.
Yes.
And it is really hard for people.
Because you can budget with cash. But what I don't understand is if a shop says to you, we don't take cash, can you actually say, well, actually, no, you have to? Can you say that?
I don't think you can, no.
No.
Because it's
then
legal.
you should take your business elsewhere.
But it's legal tender. How can they refuse cash?
You see, that's what inspired the conversation with little Gary in the pub, because I saw him buy his pint with a £5 note, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I said to him, where'd you get your news, Gary? And guess what he said? I watch a little channel called GB.
Less of the little, Gary. Less of the little. We're a big channel now. Now we have people like Carol and Sam coming to join us. We're running out of time.
Thank
Sam
you.
Lister. We'll see you next week.
Pleasure.
We'll see you next week.
Right, we've come to the end of our show. GB News Live with Mark Longhurst is going to be next. It's a big day for interest rates. We'll see you Monday, 9:30.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin, and this is your latest weather forecast from the Met Office. A blustery, boisterous day out there. Gusty winds bringing in plenty of heavy showers. Between the downpours, there will be some sunshine, but nowhere immune from the downpours. This area of low pressure is responsible. There's also a little wiggle of a waving weather front just pushing up from the south. That will bring some more persistent rain later across southern areas, certainly increasing the cloud through the afternoon here. So any sunny spells will be fairly hazy. Then lots of showers for Northern Ireland, Northern England, North Wales. A thunderstorm is possible. Not as many showers over northern Scotland, although the Northern Isles likely to stay fairly cloudy with some outbreaks of rain. The wind's a little lighter in the north as well, but elsewhere it's a blustery, gusty day. But it is quite mild. Temperatures could still reach 14 or 15 Celsius when the sun is out. We'll see a bit more in the way of rain coming into southern counties through this evening. May get into the Midlands for a time, that more persistent rain before clearing its way through East Anglia. And then we're back to more showers later in the night, chiefly for Scotland, Northern Ireland and Northern England, with southern areas becoming dry and clear. A bit of a fresher night, but still temperatures mostly staying in mid-single figures. On to Friday's details, and again, it's a case of sunshine and showers. Quite a bit of sunshine early on over the Midlands and Eastern England. Generally dry start here, but there'll be showers elsewhere. Slow-moving showers across northern parts. Further south, the showers will brush through fairly rapidly on a stiff and gusty wind. Again, between the showers, the sun will pop out, and that'll lift the temperatures into the teens in the south, 10 to 12 further north. The showery weather will continue during Friday evening. Notice the circulation here. That's where the low pressure is moving to, bringing lots of showers on Friday night across Northern Ireland and western Scotland. But as that low starts to pull away, it does look a little drier as we go through the weekend. Certainly Sunday it's drier than Saturday, and it's also going to turn colder.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes & Co.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Click that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes & Co. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway...
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Shortly, the Bank of England will be revealing whether they're increasing the base rate again. It would be the 11th consecutive rise. And this time, it's an even more difficult call for the rate setters of the Monetary Policy Committee. A shock rise in the inflation rate to 10.4% this week indicates they still have to bear